Mark Dowie, welcome to the new school.
Always glad to be here.
Mark, you recently retired from the University of California Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley, where you taught science, environment reporting, and foreign correspondence. And previous to that, you were editor-at-large of InterNation, a transnational feature syndicate based in Paris. And before that, and famously, publisher and editor of Mother Jones. You've written 7 other books, including Conservation Refugees, The 100-Year Conflict Between Global Conservation and Native Peoples, and Losing Ground, American Environmentalism at the Close of the 20th Century. You also wrote a book on foundations that we interacted a lot about because I'd written a book on it that you found somewhat useful.
Very useful.
I
plagiarized it.
Right. We've been friends for a long time, and the title of our conversation is your wonderful newish book, The Haida Gwaii Lesson, a Strategic Playbook for Indigenous Sovereignty. But we also agreed that we may stray beyond this to touch on other aspects of your work and history, including our shared interest in end-of-life strategies. So
We always do.
yeah.
Stray. We always do. It's the nature of our friendship.
We will indeed. We've been straying for a long time. So let's set the stage. Who are the Haida Gwaii?
Who are the Haida?
The Haida.
The Haida. Haida Gwaii is the place.
It's the land.
Yeah, Haida Gwaii. Well, first the place. Haida Gwaii is an archipelago in the North Pacific. You may know it as the Queen Charlotte Islands. The Haida took, or they didn't take the name back. They gave the name Queen Charlotte Islands back to the province of British Columbia and maintained the name they had called the place for pretty close to 12,000 years, Haida Gwaii. So Haida Gwaii is about 150 real islands and about another 100 rocks in this archipelago. It's one of the most beautiful cluster of islands I've ever seen in my life. It's known to biologists as the Galapagos of the North because it actually has more local endemic species than the Galapagos do themselves. So it's a very popular place for wildlife biologists, and there are always a few of them there. The Haida people themselves, they don't know, and anthropologists really don't know where they originated, which is not true of most of the native tribes in North and South America. They're very distinctive in every way. Their DNA is distinctively theirs, and they're in every other way distinctive. They have their own language, one of the very few written indigenous languages in the world, and they. Anthropologists most anthropologists have spent time in about 100 different communities before they retire, and they all end up with a short list of really remarkable people from their long list of 100 that they've lived with. Anyone that I know of who has spent any time with the Haida have them on their short list of incredibly remarkable people, and I asked them why, and so I sort of to synthesize their answer. It's all surviving indigenous communities in the world have survived because they're excelling at something, right? It could be hunting, it could be fishing, it could be art, it could be anything, navigation. There could be good migrants of one sort or another. The Haida have survived because they excel at almost everything they've ever tried to do. And that really is true. I visited for my previous book over 100 different native communities around the world on every single continent, and the Haida really do, in every way, in my mind, excel in every way you possibly can as an indigenous community. They're just, they're terrific fishermen, they're terrific hunters. Their food security is not even an issue with them. It's an issue with almost all indigenous communities. They're as I say, they're incredibly wise, incredibly. They're both ferocious and gentle at the same time. They know when to be ferocious, and but they defer to being gentle when they're not. They have survived in ways that many, many, many others in the world have not. There were at one point recorded almost 6,500 to 7,000 indigenous communities in the world. That's down now to, in terms of really active communities, down to about 4,500 now. I think if they all go, the Haida will be the last to survive. And partly because they're on an archipelago. They're not on a landmass surrounded by hostile colonialists. They've always had their own land, but they've been part of the British Empire, part of Canada, part of British Columbia, and have had to struggle for 40 to 50 years to get out of the grasps of colonial power, which they've almost completely succeeded in doing. So that's the place and the people.
You call the book,
both of which are remarkable.
You call the book The Haida Gwaii Lesson, a strategic playbook for Indigenous sovereignty. What do you mean by a strategic playbook for Indigenous sovereignty?
Well, the Haida, let me take a step back and tell you why I wrote this book. My previous book, Conservation Refugees, I visited people around the world, as I said, many, many shaman, tribal leaders, chieftains, and everything on every continent asked me, do you know the Haida? And I'd seen their art in the Vancouver Museum of Anthropology, and I'd heard things about them, but I really didn't know much about them. And I would say, why? Why do you want to know? And they all said the same thing. We want what they have. And what they have, which almost all other indigenous communities in the world do not have, is Aboriginal title to their land, and sovereignty, jurisdictional sovereignty. So I decided when I got back that this might be my next venture, and I went up and spent time in Vancouver talking to lawyers who had interacted with them, either against them or with them. I decided that this was going to be my next book. But I was going to write it not for lay readers. I was going to write it for the about 2,500 First Nations around the world that are struggling for sovereignty right now, and really struggling. So I wanted to take the Haida's experience, a 40 to 50-year experience, which I'll go into later. It's absolutely brilliant, everything they did, to accomplish sovereignty and title, and package it as a strategic playbook, so that people anywhere in the world could use the generic argument that the Haida used, and the tactics that they used, which were brilliant, to fight for and hopefully achieve sovereignty and title in their world, their country, over there, whoever occupied them, whatever colonial power occupied them. So this is a playbook. I really, to be honest, thought that I might end up selling it to maybe 300 lawyers who were working for Indigenous people around the world. But for some reason, it's caught on. It's actually done better than some of my other books. I don't quite understand why, but I'm glad about that. I'm glad you're all here. So this is, although, I have written the first half of the book for basically a lay reader. It is, in fact, the lesson that the Haida people have given to the world on how to achieve title and sovereignty over the land. And I've packaged it as a strategic playbook. The last half of the book is all the documents that they filed, all the briefs that they filed, all the arguments that they made to achieve sovereignty. It's really, really dull reading, but it had to be part of this package, which I wrote for the rest of the world. So that's what I mean by a strategic playbook for Indigenous sovereignty. Again, modeled on the Haida's experience and their strategy, which I will tell you more about later.
Now, you said there's one passage in the book that you'd like to read to us that relates to this. Do you want to read that now?
Yeah, and this is laziness, because I could say this myself, but I actually think the wording of this is better. And what this is I read probably 300 or more legal briefs, arguments, statements of one sort or another filed by other indigenous communities around the world against the people that were suppressing them. And so I read, they were mostly legal documents, pretty difficult to read. And again, these are all in nations with different court systems, different statutes, different everything. So what I did was try to synthesize all of their arguments for sovereignty and title into a single generic argument. And so this is the way it reads. And again, this could be taken and new words put in, new names put in, and it could be used as a generic argument by anybody. We have lived here for a very long time on land we have always assumed was ours. We were here long before you discovered us and our homeland, which we have never left. For all this time, we have thrived alone, without foreign assistance, and on the resources of our land and water. Despite the fact that we were secure on lands we stewarded, in a culture we developed, with a religion we owned, under laws and life of our own making, you assumed when you first observed us that we were a bunch of ignorant, heathen savages who had no idea how to manage land, forage and cultivate food, harvest medicines, worship our Creator, trade with neighbors, conduct our ceremonies, build homes, create art, or govern ourselves. And you coveted our land and the resources on and beneath it. So you conquered and subjugated us. And behind the superior firepower of your weapons, you assumed title over our land and sovereignty over us. You kidnapped and educated our children, educated in quotes, educated our children, erased our language, sold our resources to others, extinguished our rights, attempted to convert us to your religion, and turned the best of our rituals into crimes. We eventually asked you to reconsider your actions and the assumptions that informed them. You agreed to do so. Amicably, we negotiated an agreement of understanding or a governance protocol, a land use co-management plan, or a treaty, and amicably you signed it. But before the ink was dry, you broke it and returned to confiscating our land and selling our resources to people we had never met. While we are close to giving up the idea of sharing sovereignty with you, we have decided one last time to file a claim in your courts where we seek only what we believe we deserve: self-determination, sovereignty, and aboriginal title to our land, not to some of it, but to all that we say is ours.
All right.
Let's just take a moment to just sit with that. I just want to sit with that for a moment in silence. So, where did the so-called Doctrine of Discovery that enabled imperial powers to take over the land of First Nations, as you call them, following the Canadian usage, where did the Doctrine of Discovery originate?
In the Vatican.
Right.
Yeah.
With a corrupt pope.
Libertine Pope, a Borgia.
Yeah.
He was the second Borgia, I believe, to be Pope. Went under the name of Pope Alexander VI. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a long canonical letter to the King and Queen of Spain, primarily, but eventually to other monarchs in Europe, basically saying, I am giving you the rest of the world. And under the Doctrine of Discovery, you can go out and claim any land in the world simply by planting your flag on it. And I am declaring it as the direct descendant and connector with God that you have the right to do that God is giving you the right to do that through me. And that canon is still quoted in courts of law as the Doctrine of Discovery, which basically says whoever discovers land owns it, right? And I mean, a lot of the people who set out from Europe to discover land didn't believe there would be other people on the land that they found. They believed that the Americas, if they were there at all, remember, they thought they were headed for India, right, the backside of India, which is why they called the natives there Indians. So they didn't really think that there would be people there, and nor did they know or even suspect that there would be gigantic, very, very modern cities in this world, and which there were. I mean, cities with aqueducts and sewage systems and roads and beautiful, beautiful ornate buildings and beautiful ornate pottery and just the most amazing civilizations they could imagine. That didn't mean, but of course they weren't Christians, so the order from the Pope was subjugate them, right, and convert them to Christianity, and if they don't, kill them. If they don't convert, kill them. It was pretty much that simple. And even well into the history of America, the American court system, in the American Supreme Court, the Doctrine of Discovery was cited as the legal doctrine behind which we deserve to subjugate Native Americans, push them around, push them off their land, shove the Cherokee over into Oklahoma, and through the Trail of Tears, and do whatever we've done, and fight with the Iroquois, and fight with the Huron, and fight with the Mohawk, and fight with everybody to get what we wanted. It was all under the Doctrine of Discovery, and that was written by Borgia, a very, very libertine. I mean, I chuckle sometimes when I think about the scandals we're reading about in the Catholic Church. It was nothing compared to what was happening under the Borgias. Nothing. I mean, and he was the worst. And so he writes this doctrine, this canonical letter to the royalty of Europe saying, go get it, it's all yours. And I say so.
And isn't it the case that the first Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall cited the Doctrine of Discovery in order to make it part of the American law canon?
Yes, yeah.
So again, it's just...
And it's the opening document for the manifest.
Right. It's just, again, worth sitting with this and just letting it sink in that a corrupt medieval pope gave the rest of the world to the Spanish king, right? Mm-hmm. And that doctrine, you discover it, it's yours, was the basis for all the law mm-hmm. that assumes that indigenous people don't have a right to their own land. Mm-hmm. That's where it comes from.
It does.
And to this day...
It's the basis for the whole idea of sovereignty.
Yeah. It's just a remarkable fact. So I don't have a tactile picture of what an individual Haida human being who you met looks like and feels like, and you speak of them as, intelligent, able, their own written language, gentle when they can be, deeply fierce when they can't. I know that they took slaves, and you make a very cogent argument. They had three possibilities when attacked: either kill them, or send them back and they'll come back and attack you again, or turn them into slaves, so they enslaved them for 10 or 12 years. Seven.
Well, that was the probationary period, the 7 years,
right,
that's right.
Right.
And I read a passage by a journal of one of the slaves, who'd been, he was a miner who'd found his way onto the island and was illegally mining for gold on the island. So they enslaved him. And he describes his experience as a slave. And in there he says, I was well treated, very kind people, and I never ate better food in my life. I mean, Haida is just, it's a food paradise. I mean, there's just salmon jumping out of the river into your arms, and there's all kinds of wildlife on the islands. Was much more then than there is now. And they were great forager, great grower. They were agriculturalists, and so you never got a bad meal. I mean, if you were a slave, you never got a bad meal in either way. So they were one of the very, very few. I'm told there's some people in northern Africa that enslaved Europeans for a brief period of time, but I think the Haida are probably the only people who enslaved white people for any length of time, and they did. But if you were good and you were rehabilitated and you promised you weren't going to come back and I mean a lot of them were enslaved for just looking at Haida women. Boom, you're.
You said they'd burn ships.
They burned ships right down to the
just for
waterline
looking
just
at
for
a
looking
woman.
at Haida women. Yes, right. Yeah. So they were
fierce.
they were pretty
fierce.
humane slave owners, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they weren't. Nobody was held in chains. They were just. They had to work, and they had to. They were given.
So, what are they like? How tall are they?
They're a little bit. They're a little bit taller than your average native tribe in that part. In that part of the world, in British Columbia and the British Columbia coast, I'd say that the coastal tribes, the Tlingit, and the others are maybe 6 inches shorter. I don't know why. It's interesting about Haida.
Could be the food.
It could be the food, certainly partly the food. Well, another interesting thing about life on the Haida is that the largest black bear in the world is indigenous, is endemic to Haida, Haida Gwaii. That baffles again, but it's a very easy place for bears to live. They just scoop salmon out of the river, and they normally just eat the brains and throw the rest away, which fertilizes the forest. As a consequence, trees in Haida Gwaii grow anywhere from 2 to 3 times faster than trees anywhere else in the world, which is why the forest industry took such a big industry in the Haida forests. And that was really the Haida struggle was primarily against the forest industry.
Right. In other words, before the forest industry came in, they were, as I understand from the book, managing reasonably well.
Well, the trappers had been there,
Yeah.
and the fishermen had been there, and every extractive industry you can imagine was at least there to explore, if not take what they could. There actually there aren't a lot of minerals. It's a geomorphologically very interesting, geologically very interesting part of the world in that respect, and very unique part of the world in that respect. Biggest earthquakes in the world on Haida Gwaii.
And you said the waves on the west coast are like 90 feet high?
Gigantic.
Because it's right at the edge of where the ocean gets
That's right.
deep. So when the storms come in, they just pull it up right.
Yeah,
off that
and
shelf.
if you've been on the coast of British Columbia and everything, you've seen these just absolutely gigantic logs that are just broken away from dams and flood, and those logs are being tossed out of the ocean by the waves on the western shore, which is completely uninhabitable of Haida Gwaii. They're being tossed up 300-foot cliffs onto the land, knocking over other trees. I mean, it's just. And the waves pick up huge boulders. It's just wild over there on the west coast, western side of the islands.
When people want to visit Haida Gwaii, what's the deal?
Well, you can. I think probably most people that do visit, they go from Prince Rupert on a long ferry across the Hecate Strait, which is the most treacherous body of water on the planet. And if you've arrived and you still have the contents of your stomach, you arrive in Masset, and you can travel around the island from there. There's one road.
Do you need a permit to go?
No.
So
you need a permit. You do need a permit to go into the state park. The national park. The whole southern part of the archipelago is a national park, which is managed by the Haida and Parks Canada. You do need a permit to go in there, but the rest of the islands you don't.
So you take this ferry over. Do you bring a car with you?
Yes, it's a car ferry. You can.
Okay.
There's a very expensive car rental and there is a very small airstrip on the island and small planes fly from Vancouver and Victoria to this small airstrip, and you can rent a car there too. And there's just one road that goes up and down the island.
So did you drive around?
I did. Yeah.
And what's it like to drive around?
It's a 2-lane highway. It's like driving in West Marin.
There are gas stations. There are all that stuff.
I think there's 2, maybe 3 gas stations on the whole.
So when you meet Haida people, what's it like to meet a Haida person as a visitor?
They almost all speak English to begin with, and they're very friendly. In person, they're very friendly people. They're and when I told them where I was there, they would get very worried because they don't like anything that's ever been written about them, anything. They really despise anthropologists. Next down on the list would probably be historians, and third on the list of despised people would be journalists. So, which is incidentally not unique to the Haida people. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have been accused of stealing our story by people who I was just there to visit and learn something about. You're here to steal our story, I know.
So what would make them welcome somebody?
Well, if you were bringing, well, I mean, if I go back there again, I'm going to go back as a representative of the Martin Guitar Company, and
As a representative of what?
the Martin Guitar Company,
Oh, okay.
which is the best guitars in the world, and with a question for them of you guys. Most of the great spruce in the world comes from these islands, and it ends up in guitars. Why don't you guys stop selling your spruce to guitar makers and start making guitars? You guys make the most brilliant canoes in the world, the most brilliant carvings in the world. Their totems, all of the totems that you see in the West Coast, they learned how to do that from the Haida, all of the West Coast. The Tlingit and all of the other great carvers in the Northwest learned how to carve from the Haida. So they're real brilliant craftsmen. And I know, just by watching them work, that they would make great guitars. So if I go back, I'm going to be representing the Martin Guitar Company, and I will be welcome. Because I'll be bringing an industry into the island that will encourage young people to stay there, that will give them a livelihood and bring money onto the island.
Well, so speaking of that, I understand that a substantial portion of the people who live there are not Haida.
Oh, well, yeah, there are. Yeah, it's part of British Columbia, and
Right.
Remember there was a huge logging before Haida won the fight against. There was a huge community of people that were just there to log the islands.
Right, I know that.
And some of them, the whole story is that they ended up basically working together, the loggers and the Haida, and some of the people who really grew to love the Haida are still there. There was a lot of intermarriage, so a lot of people intermarried with the Haida. So yeah, there are a lot of non-Haida people there, and a lot of intermarriage, as there are with all Native communities.
And do many of the Haida sustain their ability to speak their original language?
Yeah, they're working very hard at that. It's really interesting. I visited a couple of their language labs, and it's usually a long table with very sophisticated recording equipment and old people either speaking or reading. Remember, they have their own written language, reading Haida into machines to preserve the language. I met a young man there, a carver, who had just graduated from the University of British Columbia. If you graduate from a university in Canada, you have to be fluent in one language and proficient in the other, and the other it's usually English and French. So he went to British Columbia. He said, "Could I make an exception to the two-language rule? That's all it says, two language." He said, "I want to be fluent in English and proficient in Haida." And they said, "Yes, you can graduate." So and he's probably the youngest pure Haida speaking person on the
And
island.
he is Haida himself?
He is Haida, yes, pure Haida,
Yeah.
yes, right.
Okay.
Gwalaga Heart,
So
beautiful guy.
it's facing the same acidity of modernity that everybody else is facing. In other words,
They are actually very, I mean, their fishermen have state-of-the-art fishing boats.
Yeah.
They're very modern people. They had just fallen, when I was there, a year and a half, 2 years ago, they had just fallen in love with cell phones. It was they put a cell tower on the island, and and it's really interesting to watch people, particularly Native people, who have just discovered an offshore technology, and they loved it because it helped them organize. The cell phone helped them organize, and particularly the kids who'd been off the islands, going to universities and schools. And part of their strategy was to get some of them through law school, so that they would have their own lawyers. They wouldn't have to rely on liberal lawyers in Vancouver to represent them. They have their own lawyers. In fact, the case against the Canadian Supreme Court, which established sovereignty, was argued by a Native Haida woman, who's also a brilliant singer and just absolutely stunning person. She argued it. She went in front of the Canadian Supreme Court, 7 justices, one of whom I went to school with. And she argued the case first in Haida, which they didn't understand, then in English, insisted on doing that, and got a 7-0 ruling for sovereignty out of the Canadian Supreme Court. And it's divided like the American Supreme Court. So, and I think, there was one non-Haida lawyer that accompanied her, somebody who'd argued a lot in front of the Supreme Court, and but she told me, she said, I could never, ever have won that case. It was Terry that won the case.
Wow.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of, well, let's take next the story of, because so much of the struggle for sovereignty took place around the forestry stuff.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us the story of how that struggle took shape and how ultimately the Haida won, essentially, over the forestry industry?
And the way the forestry industry works, in probably anywhere, is they go to a state or provincial government, if it's federal land, they go to the federal government and they say, there's a stand of wood of timber that we would like to cut, and they get a timber license to cut it. So up there, it's all done, because it's provincial land. It's all done through Victoria, the capital of British Columbia. So Weyerhaeuser goes to Victoria, asks for a permit to cut down a section of spruce or maple or any of there's huge trees there, any of their big trees, and almost without argument, the province will grant them the right to do it. They have to pay a stumpage fee to the province, but they get the timber. So the Haida end up with nothing, except having these heavy beer drinking, chainsaw wielding guys come into the island, cut down their trees, boom them into, and then tow them to shore, into mills on shore. They didn't even have their own mills. So it was just theft. It was outright theft. And of course, it didn't take the Haida long to realize what was happening. They're pretty smart people, and so they started as anybody by petitioning the government for the right to be part of the decision-making process. No. Some of the stumpage fees. No. And to participate in the yield harvest, the sustainable yield harvest of the islands. No. So the Forestry Department of British Columbia decided it knew best, and it needed the money, and so the Haida, they started doing it through legal processes, going to court, lost, and then finally just said, okay, we're just going to set up a barricade around our forest, and we're going to stop the loggers from coming in. And some of the most ferocious and horrible, some of the worst clear cuts ever done on the Pacific Coast were done on Haida Gwaii, on the islands of Haida Gwaii. So they just said, we're going to stand our ground, and everybody came out. Most of the inhabitants are on the north part of the archipelago, and most of the forests are in the southern part. So everybody gave up what they were doing, fishermen, old and young people, and they just went down and barricaded the forest and blockaded and of course then they call the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, to come in and protect the loggers and let the loggers log. And it was a standoff that went on and on and on. Got a lot of media coverage, and I've seen the footage. It really was incredible, the face-off. I mean, the loggers are like loggers anywhere. They're rednecks, Canadian rednecks, and pretty tough. And they don't have a lot of respect for Native people generally. But here they were being denied their livelihood and their work and everything by this randy little crowd of Native people on the islands. And it worked. It worked because, I mean, if there's a word that comes out of what they did, out of the whole history of their strategy and why it worked, the word is timing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the word is timing. I mean, the Haida never did anything without deliberating for a long, long time, and not just the tribal council or the hereditary chiefs, but everybody deliberated their strategy for a long time, and to decide whether we should go to the media first or blockade and then go to the media, or should we go to the courts first and then go to the media, and all of the different things that went into this particular strategy was very, very carefully planned with timing in mind. And timing is absolutely critical to any struggle. It's absolutely critical. Saul Alinsky will tell you that, and they had all read Saul Alinsky.
Really? They'd all read Saul
They'd all
Alinsky?
read Saul.
Wow.
Well, the leaders had read Saul Alinsky. Yeah.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, say a word about who Saul Alinsky is.
Well, Saul Alinsky was a Chicago-based activist and radical. He wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, which is really the Bible for radical activism. If you're an activist, you should read the book. I think the takeaway from Alinsky is what he calls total tactics. And total tactics says that you examine carefully every potential tactic you could use to achieve your goal before you make a move. And then you line them up, your tactics, and you do them in the right order, timing. So it's Saul Alinsky, really, who taught them that timing was the essence of what they were doing. And it was. I mean, I don't think that, I've talked to other people who've done analysis or activist analysis of what they did. They couldn't have done it if their timing had been any different or if it had been wrong. If you go to the media too soon, you blow it. If you go to the courts too soon, you'll blow it. If you blockade a mining company too soon, you'll blow it. So they very, very carefully deliberated the order of their tactics before they took the next one.
So the media, the courts, and civil action were the three key strategies.
Yes.
And my memory is that both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton studied Alinsky's work. I think Hillary's
and their opponents
thesis,
made a big thing of it.
Yeah, Hillary's thesis in college was on Alinsky, I believe, and Obama worked for a spin-off of an Alinsky group in Chicago. So
my favorite Alinsky action was in Chicago. And Chicago, when Alinsky was alive and active, Chicago had an infestation of rats that were coming off Chicago's a port, so they're coming off the port in the city. It was really serious. It was bringing disease into Chicago, and the city wasn't doing anything about it. So Saul Alinsky just went around and handed out notices to everybody who could conceivably be trapping rats or killing rats or poisoning rats or anything, to take the dead rats and put them on the steps of City Hall. Boom. It was over. The city took action right away, and the rats were gone. Yeah. But that's the kind of creative thinking that Saul Alinsky did with activism that the Haida took very seriously.
Did you know him?
I didn't.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah. So let's just take a little detour here because, and we'll come back to the Haida, but you told me that your next book, which is going to be from the University of California Press, is that working title is Now More Than Ever, and that it's looking back over 50 years of muckraking / investigative journalism that you've done. If you just were to begin to reflect on, let me just put it this way, what are the three things that you've learned from 50 years of investigative journalism about successful citizen action to make necessary changes?
Well, just to step back again on why I'm doing this book, I, as Michael said, I've been working as an investigative reporter for about pretty close to 50 years, maybe 48. And I have been keeping a sort of loose journal of ruminations about what I've been doing. And I decided that this was a good time to put them all together and into a larger rumination. I call it a defense. So the total title of the book is Now More Than Ever, A Defense of Muckraking. And I call it Now More Than Ever because during my time as an investigative reporter, it was never needed more than it is now in the world, worldwide, not just here, but everywhere. it's a sort of large rumination. It's not a memoir. I'm not going to talk at all about myself. It's going to be about the growth of muckraking from the Old Testament all to the whole world, and how it grew in America, and then
You think of the Old Testament as muckraking.
there is muckraking in the Old Testament.
Oh, that's wonderful. Tell us which parts of the.
I will tell you in the book.
All right.
I don't want to get into the Old Testament. Yes, but and of course there's a whole.
You mean the prophets, basically.
Yes, and there's a whole there's a lot of expository stories and parables.
All right.
And remember that muckraking, we know muckraking is investigative reporting that brings down the powerful people. Before that happened in America, there was classical literature by Dickens and Hugo and Zola and Chekhov and people that were exposing horrible things in their society through fiction that resulted in social change. That's muckraking.
Okay,
so
excellent.
muckraking has a much older tradition than the American form of muckraking, and that's all part of the rumination.
Oh, wonderful.
Right. And it will end up being an argument to media for continuing to do this. I mean, American media has been pretty supportive of investigative reporting, and an argument for advertisers not to bolt when they don't like investigative reporting in media, and that society needs this very, very badly and always has. And this has been a cleansing force, not just in America, but it's a cleansing force all over the world.
So back to my question, if you think about your career in investigative reporting and think about, like with the Haida, for example, their three key strategies were the courts, civil disobedience, and the media, right?
Yeah.
If you were to take that example, I know this may be an impossible question, but what have you seen work when you think of experiences that you've had where your investigative journalism or the investigative journalism of others that you respect has touched something?
Well,
what do you think works?
almost all the regulatory statutes, almost all of the regulatory bodies in the United States were stimulated by expository media investigative reporting. So take the FDA, for example. Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which was exposed the workings of the Chicago stockyards, led to the federal inspection of meat, which led to the creation of the FDA, which we're all very familiar with. So that's just one example. So a lot of the regulatory agencies, state and federal regulatory agencies, were stimulated by expository reporting of terrible things that were happening, terrible diseases that were spreading, the CDC as a consequence of investigative reporting. And I'm going to document all of that in the book. So that's one.
So that's one, but another point you made about the Haida was their exquisite sense of timing. And so we had these three things that we mentioned, but timing, in other words, not all investigative journalism results in the kinds of changes.
Not immediately.
Yeah.
No. In fact, it's remarkably slow sometimes. I mean, I did stories 40 years ago that are just now starting to get results.
Yeah.
Although some of the stories I did got immediate results. And some of them got results that were immediate and then were reversed by subs. I'll give you one example because it's really funny. During the Carter administration, I did a whole series of articles about the export of banned and hazardous products from the United States to the Third World. So it's all of these companies that regulatory agencies took their products off the market in the United States, just turned around and exported them to the Third World, where there was no regulation at all. And so people were being subjected to products that were clearly banned and hazardous. And it was just a huge series of articles that I did during the Carter administration. While he was still in office, Carter passed an executive order stopping the export of banned and hazardous products from the United States. He just said, boom, stop, period. Ronald Reagan comes into office, right, in 1980. the first executive order he signs reverses Carter's order on banning it. He says, no, we got to be able to export anything we want. Doesn't matter whether it's interuterine devices that are killing women or drugs that are killing people, whatever it is.
Or old pesticides.
Right, caveat emptor out there, third world, right? That's basically what he was saying. So now, that's an example of a lot of hard work, resulting in something that we all drank a lot of champagne around, the Carter executive order, and then was just disappeared in a heartbeat the first day after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan.
That's funny.
It is funny, but it was sad anyway.
Yeah. So I'll come back to the Haida now. I just wanted to give people a sense of that context of 50 years of investigative work that
And this is 50 years of strategic work.
Right.
The Haida story, yes.
exactly.
And remember now, these are people who had lived on these islands for at least 10,000 years. There have been artifacts found off the shores of the island, fish weirs that go back 13,000 years, and probably were Haida too. When there was a different land formation. There, 13,000 years ago. Between then and now, there was an ice age, which changed the land formation of all of that land. But the Haida Gwaii is what's called a refuge because it survived the ice age, but along the shorelines it didn't. So there are, underneath where the ice was, there are fish weirs that were probably Haida, 13,000 years old, carbon dated.
We have a mutual friend, Joan Evans, who is the executive director of the Tamalpais Trust, which works globally. It's a foundation that works globally on Indigenous First Nations rights to sacred lands and so forth. And I called her up just before the talk today and reached her. She's just come back from China. She had hoped to be here. And I asked her, what she thought of this book. I didn't realize at the time that she's the first person that you acknowledge in the book. And she said that she thought that the book was an extraordinary service. She reminded me that when she was the executive director of the Lannan Foundation, that they had funded one of the key pieces of litigation on behalf of the Haida.
That's right.
And of course, now she works with these communities all around the world. She said that what the Haida had achieved was a cultural sense of a consciousness of sovereignty that they gradually made a fact, or almost a fact. I mean, it's still contested in some ways, but that somehow they arrived at the consciousness of their sovereignty and proceeded with this long strategic project. I mean, the process by which, what did it take them, 50 years to write their constitution? When they realized that in order to be taken seriously as a nation state in the modern world, they came together and they created a constitution and a whole set of other things.
Which is in the back of this book.
Which is in the book,
Yes.
right, yeah. Say more about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, Joan Evans, who a lot of you know, was really, really encouraging and helpful with me. She knows a lot of people on Haida Gwaii leadership, people that I probably couldn't have gotten to without her. So I'm really, really indebted to her, and I'm sorry she couldn't make it today. She's got jet lag, I guess. So the other part of it was
just, in other words, her point was this this emergence of a consciousness of sovereignty and the long strategic process by which they integrated that with legal challenges and so forth.
I have a whole chapter in here on sovereignty, a short chapter on sovereignty. And it probably took me more time to write that and to research that than any others, because the word itself is probably the slipperiest word in geopolitical discourse in any language. Sovereignty is a very, very semantically tortured word. And so when you go into court and you argue for sovereignty, you have to argue for what the history of that country defined as sovereignty, what its European origin defined as sovereignty, what the Vatican defined as sovereignty, and what the province or state that you're in defined, and they're all different. And your own definition of sovereignty is going to be different. The reason I think that the Haida won sovereignty is because they said, we don't care what your definition is, right? We define sovereignty this way, and we believe we've always had it. We're not here asking for sovereignty. We're not asking you to let us have it or give it to us. We have it. We want you to get out of the way.
Yeah.
And that prevailed in court because that made sense.
Yeah.
So they weren't coming and saying, we want British sovereignty or Vatican sovereignty or any definition of sovereignty. So it's just, here's our definition of it. And very simple definition, right? It's self-determination, right? And the courts, I think that's one of the reasons they won it. Yeah. 7-0 it's common sense.
You weave together so many stories here. So there's the story of the emergence of the modern consciousness of indigenous peoples, that they are not alone, and the whole UN process of recognizing indigenous rights and indigenous peoples. Yeah. And then there's the story of the effort in Canada and other countries, but Canada specifically here, about how Canada came to terms with these claims of indigenous rights and the whole legal process by which not only the Haida but other First Nations fought that battle. Yes. And then there's the story of the emergence of the anti-forestry campaigns and the Sierra Club book on the Haida Gwaii, on Haida Gwaii as a place, and the beauty and power of the book. And so there are all these different themes. Maybe you can do a better job of counting them than I am, but there's,
The grand theme, of course, that this is part of is the very fact that 370 million people living in about 4,500 different communities, speaking 4,500 different languages, occupying, that's 5% of the world's population, occupying 20% of the world's lands, managed to put together a social movement that I think is more amazing than any other social movement in history. When you consider the fact that these are poor people without technology, a lot of them, without education, who can't even communicate with each other, let alone with the dominant language, unless they go to school in the dominant country language, put together a social movement that resulted in a UN declaration which took them 11 or 12 years to get passed, but they got it through the UN, and now that is the binding document in the United Nations recognizing the sovereignty and self-determination of it's not an enforceable declaration, but it's there to throw in the face of any country that abuses Native people, and there's still a lot of abuse going on, particularly in Chile. If I do another book, it'll probably be about. I thought about doing a book about Rapa Nui, the Rapa Nui, who are on Easter Island, which is owned by Chile, and if they had done anything that the Haida had done, the Chilean army just would have come over the island and killed them. Yeah. Right. So the point being there that Saul Alinsky's point that total tactics mean you do something differently every time you do it, right? And that's the art of war. I mean, Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and everybody who wrote about the art of war, they came away with basically the same thing that Saul Alinsky said: don't ever do the same thing the same way twice. Right. 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 So that's what they did. They said, we're not going to do it the way. They looked at the American Indian movement. They looked at other movements around the world and other struggles around the world for sovereignty. They weren't impressed. They said, we're going to do it our way. We're going to figure out how to do it right in the context of where we are, the context of who we're up against, the global forest industry and the provinces of British Columbia and the nation of Canada. We're going to do it and make it work here. Yeah. Right.
Let me.
That was all happening at the same time that Native communities around the world were joining with each other and turning up. I mean, I go to a lot of international conferences. They're there, right? sometimes invited, sometimes not invited. But they're there to make their claim, make their point that they deserve to be part of the international dialogue of whatever the dialogue is about. Public health, whatever it is, they deserve to be there. And they make themselves very clear. And they usually, I know who they are now, so I see them. They're standing up against the wall. They really sit in the audience. They stand up against the wall, and they wait at these international conferences where they're not part of the agenda or not part of the program. And then right at the end, they'll raise their hand, and they'll just blow everybody in the room away.
Right.
With an observation they've made. Just remarkable. That movement to me is just so incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
The Native movement.
Is there anything else you want to say about the Haida before I shift into some of your other work? Anything you'd like to add or summarize?
No, I just, I just hope they, all of the other books that have been written about the Haida, not about their struggle, but just about them and their language and everything, they hate all the books. I don't know, and I'd ask them, but why do you hate Ian Gill's book? Why do you hate this? And really, one of Canadians' famous poets, Broadbent, they hate his book. I don't know why, but it's all because they felt they weren't respected, or they felt that something humorous was being said at their expense. There were a lot of different reasons why, but it basically boiled down to a lack of respect. So. And I knew this before I started the book. So I figured when I go up there, I've got to figure out, and with the help of John Evans and one or two other people that know the Haida well, I figured out how to approach them respectfully. And that's really important. There's a word in their language which is in this book, and I can't pronounce it. It's got about 18 syllables. But it's the most important word in their language, and it means respect. It's respect.
Right.
When they mean it, they mean respect for the land, respect for their children, respect for visitors, respect for each other, respect for God, just respect in the broadest sense. That's what they teach their children, respect. So I figured I'll try to figure out what they mean by it and act accordingly. I got along fine with everybody up there, and I still to this day have not heard very much from the Haida about whether or not I haven't heard anything that they disliked it. The Haida Nation, which is the government of Haida, ordered a whole bunch of books to put in the government bookstore. So that's a pretty good sign.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I think it's an extraordinary book, and I deeply commend it. And also, just as a writer and a student of writing myself, it's beautifully written, beautifully organized, and it's quite a masterpiece of writing. So I love it. Actually, there's a quote on the cover from Barbara Ehrenreich saying, "America's foremost investigative reporter," which is quite a statement.
And one on the back from Studs Terkel.
Saying, "Mark Dowie is, pound for pound, one of the best investigative journalists around." Did he weigh you? Is that how he...
No, but I'll tell you a quick funny story behind that. He wrote that for a book that I wrote in the 1980s. Right? But read it, it's a generic quote, right?
Yeah, right.
So years later, he and I are in New York at the same time, at the same meeting, and we were really bored. We were standing in the back of the room, we were really bored, and I said, "Studs, let's get out of here. Let's go grab a beer." And Studs said, "No, I got better. I got tickets to the Cubs-Yankees game. Let's go to the ball game." I was standing there with him and, God, I can't remember who the other guy was. But anyway, so off we go to the ball game. And we're sitting there drinking beer and everything. And I say, "Studs, you gave a quote to my book about organ transplanting." And I cited this quote back to him. I said, "Would you ever mind if I used, that's a generic quote, it could be used on any book. Can I use it again?" He said, "Be my guest." So the other guy that was with us was Sidney Zion. And so I wanted to use it again, but I told the publisher about that, and they said Studs had died by then. And my publisher said, "Oh, we can't do it unless we're absolutely sure that that he said it." I said, now Sidney Zion was dying at the time; he was really sick, and so I said, "Oh, well, the only person who heard it was Sidney Zion. So why don't you call him and check and see if he remembers it?" So about 3 days before Sidney Zion dies, my publisher calls him up and says, did Studs Terkel say this to Mark Dowie? Zion said, yeah, well, I remember that. So this is the third or fourth book it's been on. I love generic blurbs, right?
So this is where what I'd really like to ask you. We are sitting here a week before the midterm elections in the United States. And over the last however many years, with the new regime in Washington, America has changed. How do you hold what is happening in the United States, also in the context of what's happening around the world with the rise of authoritarian regimes? How do you, in your experience, hold what's happening in the world?
Well, first of all, I'm North American. I was conceived in Mexico, born in Canada, and have lived in the United States. So I'm North American. So I'm a little more international than most people I know. However, and my father was a citizen of 6 different countries when he died. Had been a
What 6?
What 6?
Yeah.
England, Scotland, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Trinidad.
He was a citizen of all those countries?
Well, you had to be a citizen of South American companies.
How did he do that? What was he doing that made him a citizen of all those countries?
He was harvesting fruit salts.
Fruit?
Fruit salts. The progenitor of bicarbonate of soda.
Oh,
he was
really?
a chemist, yes.
Oh, no kidding.
But he owned the companies, and if you owned a company in any Mexico or any
You needed
South
to be a
American
citizen.
company, you had to be a
Okay,
citizen.
I get it.
So, right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm a kind of international guy, but I'm not an authority at all on history or politics or everything. I've been really focused on. I'm kind of a cowboy who learned how to write. I mean, and I've spent most of my time as a writer focusing on things that I needed to write, which is stuff that I'd uncovered as a reporter. So I think you're asking a question of me, Michael, that I'm probably no better equipped to answer than you are. So why don't you answer it? No, seriously, I'm very alarmed by this surge of authoritarian.
Yeah.
But it's not the first time it's happened in the world.
No.
And it probably won't be the last.
No.
And I don't think it is going to last.
Well, that's a good thought.
I don't think so. I don't. But particularly in this country, I live in this country because I could have lived in any of the countries my father had been a citizen of, and I was educated in Canada. I could have lived there, but I chose this country because of its promise. Now I'm disturbed at how its promise is being eroded, quite actively and deliberately by people in power now, and maybe a country with this kind of promise to be the model for the world and the great melting pot, maybe it needs to be shaken up every now and then. And maybe we need to fight back against fascism every now and then. And when I worked and virtually lived in Europe for a while, and one of the things I used to do in my spare time was visit the resistance museums that exist in almost every country in Europe. They're fascinating. Some of them are open to the public, some of them aren't, but if you say you're a journalist, they'll let you look at the archives, and it's fascinating, the history of resistance to this very thing we're facing now, authoritarian fascism around the world, and how it was done, how it was strategized. Again, Alinsky probably read all the files too, but I'm heartened by that Europeans were able to effectively fight back against fascism in many, many different countries in Eastern and Western Europe and prevail. So I think we can fight back against it.
You describe yourself as a cowboy who learned to write, which is a nice phrase. What drives this cowboy through 50 years of investigative work? What is the underlying passion or sense that you've devoted your life to 50 years of it? Why have you done it?
I don't know if you can refer me to a good psychiatrist. He can probably work it out of me, and I'll let you know what he comes up with or she comes up with. But I don't know. I mean,
is it anger?
There's always a certain amount of anger. I mean, I became an investigative reporter out of pique. I was a publisher, remember, and the magazine I was publishing, Mother Jones, was not publishing hard-hitting investigative material. We were promising that we were going to, and I was signing the letters, promising that we were going to do it, building this huge circulation around this promise. We weren't doing it, and I invaded an editorial meeting one day and said, "Hey, where are these stories that you're promising?" And they sort of said, "We don't know how to do it. We don't know anyone that does." I said, "This isn't rocket science. You can walk into spend 10 minutes inside any corporation and you'll find dirt, right?" And they said, "Well, why don't you do it?" Right? So I started with the A.H. Robbins Company, who had just manufactured the Dalcon Shield intrauterine device, which had already by that time killed about 25 women in America. And I started there, and I've worked my way through probably 200 corporations since. My beat has always been corporations.
Give us a sense of, name 3 to 5 others that you particularly like your work on.
Well, I'm most proud of the one I've already told you about, the export of banned and hazardous products. And we're looking at probably 100 different companies that were doing that in the United States. But I'm probably most famous for the Pinto story.
Tell us that.
Well, that was, I don't really remember the Ford Pinto, but in the 70s, Ford put this little car on the market that they knew when they put it on the market was going to blow up in very low speed rear end collisions, and it did, and it killed a lot of people. So I started investigating what was going on, and I found a document in the Department of Transportation that basically was a cost-benefit analysis that Ford had created for themselves. I don't know how it wandered into there. That shouldn't have been in the Department of Transportation, but it was. And so the calculus was a certain number of people are going to die in these cars, but it's going to cost us a certain amount. And we could settle all of those cases, right? Or we can fix the car. It will cost us more to fix the car than it will to settle the cases, so let's burn a few people and forget it. That's basically what the calculus was. So, and that story was a seminal story in terms of corporate investigative reporting because it exposed that calculus for the first time. So I'm probably most famous for that story, and it was a paradigm story. Absolutely, it broke a whole bunch of new information about corporate behavior. But I wish I got credit for some of the other stories I did, but because I've done hundreds of investigative reports. And
your book on foundations. What was the message of your book on foundations?
I think the central message is that foundations were created in the United States by giving very wealthy people an opportunity to control their money through philanthropy rather than pay taxes. So if you look at the corpus of a foundation, $5 billion, $20 billion, whatever it is. If the foundation hadn't been created, 55% of that money would have gone into the state and federal treasury of the United States. Therefore, we, the people, own 55% of those foundations. Well, that's not the way they operate. They operate as if it's their private money, they created it, they control it, they put their people on the board, they say what the foundation is going to spend its money on. We have no control at all. So the central argument of that book is that organized philanthropy, foundation philanthropy, should be a much more democratic process than it is. And I think if it was, it would work a lot better. That's the central argument.
You know, as you know, I inherited one of the alumni of our cancer help program. Actually, 2 of them left foundations in my charge, and it was such a psychic strain to suddenly be responsible for these foundations after years of just asking people for money and never having any. And I wrote this book called A Gift Observed, Reflections on Philanthropy and Civilization, which is a very strange book, but has circulated in the funder community for many years. And one of the things I learned was that if you examine who benefits from American philanthropy, that it unquestionably tends to be the class from which the money comes, and that even in social services, it tends to be the people from
It's the big elite universities.
and therefore and actually an argument that I make that I haven't seen elsewhere is that the greatest example of a successful philanthropic strategy in American history is the Reagan Revolution, which was planned by a very coherent set of conservative foundations and sustained to this day. The Powell Memorandum, which you know about, later Supreme Court Justice Powell, who wrote this memorandum about how to engineer essentially the Reagan Revolution. And then there was this very disciplined effort to put all of that into place. And people say to themselves, well, why is it that progressive foundations can't do the same thing? And the answer is really very simple. It's a fundamental fact of Saul Alinsky and all strategic organizing. You can only organize effectively if you're organizing in your own self-interest. And progressive philanthropy, which is basically wealthy people organizing on behalf of other people, are not organizing in their own self-interest, whereas the conservative foundations had an extremely clear sense of what they were about. And whereas progressive philanthropy cares about 100,000 different things, conservative foundations said, these are the critical moving pieces that we need to control in order, because they were worried about, you know, what looked to them like socialist chaos and so on and so forth. And so they did this extraordinary piece of work. I don't know if you've seen this new book called Winners Take All. Have you seen it? I think it's by a New York Times. Does anybody know the name of the new book? But it's an extraordinary book, which basically says, beware of extraordinarily wealthy people telling you how they're going to save the world. And it's a beautiful piece of investigative work. So anyway, we share this interest in...
And I plagiarized a lot from your book.
Yeah, and you were very honest about it, and I'm grateful for your honesty. And typically for me, I never tried to publish it except privately. And
no, but you very early, I don't think you'd even finished it. When I told you I was going to do this book, you handed me your manuscript.
Yeah, I
said,
did.
Here, take it or leave it.
Yeah, well, that's how I like to work.
Right. Well, very generous.
So I'm going to close and then ask some from a conversational question from the audience. But the last piece, we were just talking about a beloved friend of both of ours who is nearing the end of his life. And that got us onto a subject that both of us care about, which is our ability to choose how we leave this earth. And you've actually talked about that and written about it some. And you
made a radio documentary about it too, right?
You did a documentary?
I made a radio documentary.
Oh, you did?
Yes, right.
And so we were talking and
which can be found on SoundCloud.
What's it called?
It's called Helping a Loved One Die.
Okay.
And it can be found on SoundCloud.
So why don't we start there? What if you want to help a loved one die, what do you need to know?
Well, I need to spend a lot of time with the person first, and be sure that they, one, are really dying, and two, really want to die before they go through a dangerous or painful or dystopic end game, right? And that's usually the situation that I've been faced with, and I think which now so many physicians in California under the new statute are faced with. So that's the first thing I want to know. I mean, when I did it, when I helped people die, which I did, I've done 4 times. I was committing a felony in the state of California, that punishable by 15 years in prison. And if a doctor had done the same thing as I did, he or she would have been committing a felony.
They would have lost their license.
At very least.
Yeah.
Or been charged with a felony.
Right.
That's changed, right? So, although the California statute against assisting suicide still survives. So if you're helping someone commit suicide, you are committing a felony in the state of California. I never did that. I never defined or regarded what I was doing as assisting suicide. I didn't think so. I was helping people hasten their death, and that's what the new statute in California, the End of Life Options Act, allows people to do now, to go to the physicians and their physician.
And that's sweeping the country, and you have it in Oregon and Washington State,
and there's statutes
Montana, and
in
so
about
on.
25 other states right now. There's statutes pending, laws pending. So, you know, I just hope, I wish they'd just do what Canada just said, okay, it's national law in the country, but anyway, that's not going to happen in this administration. But anyway.
So we were talking, and you told me that Kaiser now is using Seconal, and that the really good stuff to use is Nembutal. And you told me that right after the California law passed, that the drug company that manufactures it quadrupled the price.
Both companies. There's only one company that makes Seconal, and that's Lilly in the U.S., and the one company that provides Nembutal, and that's Valiant. And they both grossly raised the price of those after the act was passed.
You know, it feels, forgive me, but it feels criminal to me.
Of course it is.
Yeah, it feels criminal.
Unlike anything else Big Pharma's ever done.
Yeah. No, obviously, but truly, to make it that hard for people to avoid suffering.
Exactly.
Just feels absolutely.
Kaiser, which is, provides the care. Kaiser has agreed to go along with it right now, and our mutual friend who is dying has been approved by Kaiser for the end-of-life option when he's ready, and Kaiser's bringing him the Seconal that he needs, but the copay is $2,000.
Yeah, and you have to
and it would be double that if it was Nembutal.
And you have to grind up 90 pills to do it.
You have to grind it. You have to empty 90 pills. Somebody has to do it for you. Probably not going to be well enough to do it. You have to 90 pills yourself, mix it up, and you have to take 2 other anti-nauseants before. Otherwise, you might wake up in a pool of vomit.
Whereas the Nembutal
no, Nembutal is much better.
Is much, much better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all the countries in Europe that have legalized euthanasia and end-of-life options, they all use Nembutal.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I just feel that, I was saying to you, it goes back to John Stuart Mill. It's sort of fundamental principle of English jurisprudence that we have a right to decide what we do with our own bodies. And for me, it's a very high barrier that, or a very high hurdle that a government should need to get over to stop us from doing that. And so, I welcome this new legislation, but first of all, I think that they make it arduous, and a number of people at Commonweal are working on trying to make it less arduous. And secondly, I just think this is criminal, what's going on with the price of these things.
Well, that is.
Yeah.
And, I mean, some of the arguments against it have some merit. I mean, I think you don't want to open it up so widely that you encourage elder abuse and you're dispatching grandma to get her estate, and that sort of, all of which is potentially could be done. And there are, I think, 6 organizations of disabled people in the United States who are fighting this legislation. For that very reason, they're afraid that people are just going to say, you're an enormous drain on the family, you're disabled, we're going to find a way to help you out. And so I think there has to be very, very careful oversight of this practice, or it will be abused.
I agree with you. I agree with the arguments that people make against it. I deeply understand them. And I think it's a very personal question as to which side you come down on this. For myself, having done the Cancer Help Program for 33 years and just watched a lot of people leave the world with a lot more suffering than they needed to.
Sure.
But I agree that there isn't a simple answer to it. And therefore, what seems like the cautions to keep it from being abused also make it bureaucratic, and not responsive So I don't think there's a simple response to it.
No, there isn't. And as a lot of people pointed out to me when I was working on my radio documentary about this, people who write an advance directive when they're in their 20s or 30s and go back and look at it when they're 50 or 60 say, whoa, I got to change this. Right? I mean, the goalposts shift as you get older.
They do.
And you know, when you're 30 years old, you think, as soon as someone else has to wipe my butt, I'm out of here, right?
Right.
Right? And then you get to that position, you find it's not so bad. Right? I can live with this. So, I mean, the goalpost shifts as you get older. So, all of the arguments that an advance directive is something you should act on, and the thing. But you're absolutely right, and so is John Stuart Mill, that we essentially should control the end of our lives and have complete control over the end of our lives. Mm-hmm. And the idea that is practiced by hyper-religious health institutions, that you keep people alive even if their health directive says do not intubate. Mm-hmm. And do not resuscitate. You intubate and resuscitate anyone because God takes them out. We don't, and they don't take themselves out. Yeah. Right. So that's really what we're up against here is hyper-religious views of life and death.
Yeah.
They're playing God by intubating.
Yes, right.
God does intubate.
So I want to open it up to some comments. Let's start with our original subject, the Haida. And any comments or questions on the Haida? Did I see it? Yes.
I'd like to know if you can tell us anything we can learn from their governing structure.
Yeah, they again were very, very studious. They went out and examined the governing structure of many, many nations, including Canada and British Columbia and the United States, and Europe, and other native, the Iroquois. Civilization, which has a very, very similar constitution. In fact, we modeled our democracy on the Iroquois. You may know that. So they looked at these other nations, both European and non-European nations, and they put together, as Michael said, it took them almost 50 years to draft their constitution. And the constitution is in here, and it's brilliant. To me, it's a synthesis of a standard democratic constitution that you would see with the United States or Canada or any constitutional democracy, and a very, very earth-committed, land-committed civilization of people. Their land rights to them are just way, way, way more. And when they say land rights, they don't mean our rights to the land. They mean the land's right not to be abused. That's written into their constitution. The non-abuse of land, the non-abuse of the creatures that live on the land. And their constitution protects animals as well as humans. I mean, the wording is very similar, but the protections are very different.
Yeah. Others, yes.
Did the Spirit Bear Youth Coalition play any role?
Sure.
They
sure.
did?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and fight both ways. I mean, the Haida were very active in that coalition, as well as the Spirit Bear people, yeah. Spirit Bear is, for those of you who don't know, is a very unique bear to the west coast of British Columbia. And it's not a polar bear, but it's an albino bear. It's a very, very light-colored, beautiful, beautiful bears that exist on the west coast of British Columbia. And they became the symbol for a coalition, a native coalition on the coast. Yeah.
Other questions?
George?
Yeah, Mark. Clearly, you put the book out not just for First Peoples to read, but for us to read also. And I'm curious, on Haida Gwaii, are there any politics, or is there only governance? In other words, we're stuck in our era now between politics out of control and the suffering of efficient governance because of the politics, right? Did you see?
I do. They're political people, and they have their conflicts, and they have their conflict resolution systems. They have courts, and there's a lot of mediation. One of the interesting things that I found about the Haida, which I put a sidebar about in this book, is about Haida power. And the Haida, if you haven't read the book, if you've read it, excuse me for repeating something you've already read, but if you look at a Haida power, on the surface, it looks like pretty much like a patriarchy, right? The men, the chiefs, all the chiefs they've ever had except for one has been a man. The hereditary chiefs are men. The local chiefdoms of the villages and everything gets handed down through male to male to male to male. However, if you go in and you listen and you watch closely, you'll learn. And I learned this from one woman who told me this about 3 weeks after I'd been there. I had no idea. She said, well, you know that behind every powerful man in Haida Gwaii, there's 5 or 6 women. 5 or 6 women. And it's a committee, it's a formal committee of women that have known the man almost all his life. Some of them are aunts, some of them are sisters, some of them are, but they're women who known the man all their lives. The only qualification that is required to be on part of one of these committees, and this is the way she worded it, was the woman has to be past her moon, right? So they're elderly women. There's 5 or 6 elderly women behind every powerful man. He cannot do anything without going to his committee, right? He cannot negotiate anything. He cannot go buy a major piece of equipment. He can't do anything. He can't go to the government and petition the government without first going to his committee of women. So who's really in power in Haida Gwaii, right?
Do they have political parties?
No.
Inequalities? Inequality.
Well, I suppose a lot of the people who were slaves when they were released from slavery stayed with the Haida. They either intermarried or they stayed, but that's a subclass in Haida. But it's like the relationship you have with someone who you spend most of your time kidding about your differences and everything. So the Haida kid the ex-slaves a lot, right? And they're always telling them they should go move to another neighborhood, right? And that, but it's not hostile really. It's kind of joking and capping and kidding. But there is definitely a class. So the children of slaves are, everyone knows who the children of slaves are. They're treated a little bit differently, and of course a lot of them they're white slaves, so they're not Haida ethnically or genetically. So there's some strata.
Ned?
So I'm curious about commerce. What sort of commerce that you're sort of suggested it's a modern place? I mean, they're simply taking control of their land and managing their forests in such a way that suits them, but also that is probably what they have as their you say they're good at everything, so maybe they're good fishermen and they're good this and that. So all their commerce is
The Haida had a currency before any civilization in the world had a currency. And I have at home, I should have brought it. I have a Haida coin currency, and they're made out of copper, and they're called coppers, and they range in size from something about like this to something that only 10 men can carry. And they're either identical, they're just bigger, right? But that's their currency. So you want to buy a house, you got to get 10 guys to carry one of these big pieces of copper, right, to buy the house, right? They're Canadians now, they're in the Canadian money system, monetary system, but that's from very recently. They had a currency trading system interior, just inside Haida Gwaii for thousands of years, way, way, way before anybody else had a currency. They did.
That's
so
amazing.
They're sophisticated economists. They understand how money works. They understand. I mean, they had a reserve of coppers and currency, and they were loaning money way, way, way before other civilizations were loaning money. They're really remarkable people. I mean, as any anthropologist will tell you.
And my next question is education. What could you say about their education system? How they raise their children in terms of education?
Education is very, very valuable. And I mean, when you heard me read my thing, their children were at one point taken out of the community and educated in the Canadian schools and sent back as good Canadians who spoke English and practiced Christianity. But the Haida schools now, they teach all of the skills that we learned in school, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they also learn Haida history, Haida culture, Haida language, and there's every attempt made through the education to preserve Haida culture.
And then does that include like craftsmanship things as well?
Yes. And they are very highly skilled craftsmen, highly skilled. They make canoes out of a single piece of wood that will carry 60 paddlers, 30 on each side. And when one of the protests, they took that canoe down to Vancouver with 60 paddlers. Appeared in the harbor in Vancouver, right, with 60 paddlers. That got attention. That got media attention.
Don't.
Well, this is a broader question, if you're ready for that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this idea of manifest destiny and Pope and all of that, it has seemed to me, looking, back as far as there's documentation that peoples, tribes, civilizations for thousands of years at least have somehow decided for themselves that they're the best and sort of degraded the people whose land or resources they want to conquer, and they've just gone in there and wiped them out or enslaved them, or Genghis Khan and there's a whole bunch of them, and in tribes as well. Tribes in Peru, even recently, still have taken it as sport to go and raid another tribe and kill the men and take the women, and so I'm just wondering if this is like a very deep part of the human genome and down back into our reptilian brain, and that's why it bursts forth when somebody condones it. It's just been repressed by civilization. Then along comes Trump and says, "Hey, this is fine to be this way, and go at it," and it just comes out. It's been pent up, and I mean that's a very disturbing thought for me, but it just seems to have played out so many times. That's the way we are.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to observe that all of the bad things that people did to people were not Europeans suppressing native people. Probably the most vicious war ever fought in North America was between the Huron and the Iroquois. Absolutely vicious war. The shit they did to each other, nobody would ever even imagine, doing to people. Skinning people alive, really, really horrible. You don't want to hear it. Horrible. So yeah, and the Paiutes, you don't want to mess with the Paiutes if you're a Plains Indian. They'll wipe out a village of other native people in a heartbeat if you get in their way or you hunt on their land. That's over now, but so yes, you're right. I mean, everybody isn't beautiful and wonderful just because they're indigenous, and Europeans and European settlers and colonists were not the only people who subjugated other people. You're right. But the whole idea of manifest destiny was not invented by Indians, not invented by native people.
Oh, I guess my ultimate question is, given that, if that's part of our genome, how do we get beyond it?
I don't think it is part of our genome.
Okay.
If you believe in genetic determinism of behavior, you're entitled to believe it. I don't.
Okay. Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah.
So, are there other indigenous people who have used the Haida method of getting sovereignty?
Yes.
Like in North America, or?
And the Haida have made it very clear that they will come anywhere that they're invited to come and help people do this, right? And the guy who was the chief of the Haida during most of this, an amazing guy named Guja, who's now retired. He's been retired now for almost 10 years. He travels all over the world, basically teaching this lesson, right?
Are they using your book, do you think?
I think he is, yes, yeah. I mean, he likes the book. He told me that. I talk about him in here. I interviewed him twice, a great length, once sitting and once walking. But both times I had to take notes. You can imagine hiking, and this guy just walks like 18 miles an hour, so I'm trying to take notes. But what an amazing, amazing guy, really.
Couple more questions. Yes.
I would just like to suggest that using a papal decree for American government policy is a violation of the separation of church and state.
We'll tell John Marshall that.
Next time I see him.
One more question? Comment?
I mean, one thing about the Haida people that I think I forgot to tell you is that they are fundamentally and culturally anti-narcissistic people. So they really, really resisted the whole idea of having me turn any of them into heroes of this story. And I was warned about that, and I was warned by their elders, and I was warned by the women who described the power, and think, don't do that. And it's really tempting to take this guy Guja, who I've mentioned, and turn him into a national hero, which he should be, but he would hate the book if I'd done it, and the Haida would give him a bad time if he did it, if I did it. Why do you deserve all this credit when it was us? This was not a war, a battle struggle fought by heroes. It was fought by people, just ordinary people.
Mark, one last question. I've been sitting here looking at your right arm, which bears the tattoo, certain of nothing. What is the story of your tattoo?
I should have rolled my sleeves down. You, of course, most of you will remember Tony Anthony Bourdain, who I regard as a journalist, incidentally, not as a chef, although he's probably one of the best chefs ever. But if you watched his program over the years, you realize that this guy was a preternaturally brilliant internet foreign correspondent. And so, I never knew him, but I really grew to love him through his program and through the things that I'd read, that he'd written and about him. And he coincidentally took his life just over a year after one of my children did. And he had, before he took his life, he was covered with tattoos. And the last tattoo, and it wasn't right before he took his life, but the last tattoo that he'd had was around his bicep. He said, "I am uncertain. I am certain of nothing." And I knew that. And so after he died, and I thought, and my son, who took his life about a year before, was uncertain of everything, but certain of nothing. And I thought, in tribute to them both, I'm just going to get this tattoo. And it's a conversation starter, because it doesn't just mean one thing. Oh no, I've had great conversations that started with people reading my arm, and it has more than one meaning, right? Being certain of nothing, and it's, of course, it is the bedrock of nihilism. It's the bedrock of skepticism. It's every journalist should read this before they start a story, because if you go into a story certain about anything, you're going to the story up. Right? So it's kind of a journalist mantra, in a way, to be certain of nothing until you've tied down the facts, and then be certain of everything before you file a story. But because the fact checkers are going to get you if you aren't. But so I use it. I look at it every day and think about it every day, and think about Tony and my son and what it means. Yeah.
Mark Dowie, author of The Haida Gwaii Lesson, a Strategic Playbook for Indigenous Sovereignty, an investigative reporter for almost 50 years. Barbara Ehrenreich calls you America's foremost investigative reporter. Thank you so much for being with us at the New School.
You're welcome. And Barbara was my first co-author that I ever worked with. Yeah. I'm still in love with her. She's just the most delightful, easygoing, easy to work with person. I just had a great time.
Thank you so much.
Sure.